Welcome back. In this video, we're going to go into detail about the within subjects design. In the last video, I mentioned that there are two major types of experiments in psychology. One is called a between subjects design, and one is called a within subjects design. And I also briefly discussed the pros and cons of the two types of experiments. I briefly discussed the relative advantages and disadvantages of these two types of experiments. And I also mentioned that neither type of experiment is better. It's just that a between subjects design has its own pros and cons, and a within subjects design has its own pros and cons. So when a researcher is planning an experiment and needs to decide between a between subjects and a within subjects design, the researcher just has to carefully weigh the advantages and disadvantages of the two types of experiments, and then decide which type of experiment would be a better fit for his or her study. And this is just another example of this recurring theme in our class, that in general, research methods aren't good or bad. It's just that research methods have their own pros and cons, their own strengths and weaknesses. Now, there are some types of research methods that are generally considered inferior, but in general, research methods aren't sorted into good or bad types of methods. It's just that each method comes with its own pros and cons. And in this video, we're going to go into a little bit more detail about the pros and cons of between subjects and within subjects designs. And we're also going to go over how to do a within subjects design properly so that the results are valid and unbiased, and so that the results aren't affected by confounding variables. But before we go any further, I want to give a quick recap of the difference between subjects and within subjects design, just to make sure we understand the definitions clearly before we move any forward. So, like I mentioned, a between subjects design is an experiment in which each participant is randomly assigned to one condition and experiences that one condition only. So, if a between subjects design is being run with two conditions, A and B, like let's say a hot room and a cold room, then each participant is randomly assigned to one condition, A or B, and experiences that one condition only. And the researcher will end up comparing two groups of people, one experiencing condition A and one experiencing condition B. And if a between subjects design is being run with three conditions, A, B, and C, like let's say a 60-degree room, a 70-degree room, and maybe an 80-degree room, just as an example, then each participant will be randomly assigned to condition A, condition B, or condition C, and will experience that one condition only. And the researcher will end up comparing three separate groups of people, one in condition A, one in condition B, and one in condition C. So a between subjects design is the way that we've been thinking about an experiment all semester. All of my examples up to this point have been examples of between subjects designs. They've all been examples of experiments in which there are separate groups of people, and each group is in a separate condition. So, remember, in a between subjects design, condition A means group A, condition B means group B, condition C means group C, and so on, because, like I said, each condition has its own separate group of people. Now, in a within subjects design, each participant goes through all conditions of the experiment, one at a time, and each participant is repeatedly tested or repeatedly observed. So, if a researcher is doing a within subjects design with two conditions, A and B, each participant will be tested under condition A and tested under condition B on two separate occasions, and each participant will provide the researcher with two separate scores, one score for A and one score for B. And if a within subjects design is being run with three conditions, A, B, and C, then each participant will provide the researcher with three different scores, one for condition A, one for condition B, and one for condition C. So in a within subjects design, a researcher has one group of participants, and each participant goes through all conditions of the experiment, one at a time. So, and actually, before we move forward, I want to just give a quick example of an imaginary experiment and discuss how that experiment would be done as a between subjects design and how it would be done as a within subjects design. I want to do this just to make the difference between these two types of experiments as concrete as possible. So, so I think it might help you better understand the difference if you can tie it to a concrete example. So here's a quick imaginary example. So let's say a researcher wants to test a certain type of running shoe. Let's say a researcher wants to test a new type of running shoe that just came out and compare it to an older brand of running shoe that's been out for a while. And the researcher wants to look at which type of shoe appears to be better for running performance. If the researcher did a between subjects design, the researcher would randomly assign the participants to two separate groups, and one group would run one time with the new shoe, and the other group would run one time with the old shoe, and each participant would contribute only one score because each person is running just one time, and the researcher would compare the scores of the new shoe group with the scores of the old shoe group, and then reach a conclusion about which type of shoe appears to be better on average. If the researcher wanted to do a within subjects design, the researcher would have each participant run twice, one time with the new shoe and one time with the old shoe, and the researcher would get two scores from each person. And then the researcher would compare the scores with the new shoe against the scores with the old shoe and decide which type of shoe appears to be better. And yeah, so in the within subjects design, the researcher would want to give the participants at least somewhat of a break between the two sessions. So it might be that on one day, each participant runs with one type of shoe, and then on the next day, each participant runs again with the other type of shoe. And then that way the researcher would get the two scores from each person. And like I said, that would be the within subjects design. Now, what if the researcher wanted to test three types of shoes and look at which one appears to be the best for running performance? Well then, if it was a between subjects design, the researcher would randomly assign the participants to three separate groups. And one group would run with shoe A, one group with shoe B, and one group with shoe C. And if a researcher wanted to do the within subjects design, the researcher would have each participant run three times. One time with shoe A, one time with shoe B, and one time with shoe C. So hopefully this is helping you understand the difference a little bit more clearly or concretely. And if you think about it, in a within subjects design, the researcher is just reusing a group of people. So instead of having a separate group for each condition, the researcher is just taking one group of people and retesting that same group for every condition. That's really what a within subjects design is. And so actually quickly, but before we move ahead, I wanted to give you something to think about quickly that should help this sink in just a little bit more. So this is what I'd like for you to think about. In a between subjects design, the number of conditions equals the number of groups. So two conditions means two groups, three conditions means three groups, and so on. In a within subjects design, the number of conditions equals the number of times that each person is tested. So two conditions means each person is tested twice, three conditions means each person is tested three times, and so on. Like I said, that's just something for you to think about. So now let's move ahead. So random assignment is used in both types of experiments. Early on this semester, we learned that random assignment is used in any type of experimental study. So, in a between subjects and a within subjects design, random assignment is used. But what happens after the random assignment is different. So in a between subjects design, the researcher randomly assigns participants to separate groups, and then each group goes into their assigned condition. and that's it. And in a within subjects design, the researcher randomly assigns the participants to separate groups, and each group actually follows a certain order of conditions. So um, each group goes through all of the conditions, but the groups follow different orders. So that's why I said random assignment to orders of conditions for within subjects design. So if a researcher is doing a within subjects design with two conditions, A and B, then the researcher would randomly assign the participants to two separate groups, and one group would do condition A followed by condition B, and the other group would do condition B first followed by condition A. And you could call them the AB group and the BA group. And if a researcher wants to do within subjects design with three conditions, A, B, and C, then the researcher would need more than two groups of people because, well, one group would be following ABC, one group would be following BAC, one group would be following CAB, and so on. We'll get into that in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. But right now I want you to understand that this process of randomly assigning participants to separate orders of conditions in a within subjects design has a name, and it's called counterbalancing. And quickly, before we move on, you might notice how I said on the slide that matching is optional in a between subjects design. So matching is something that we'll get into in more detail in this week's activity, but we haven't talked about it in too much detail yet in our class, except we did one time when we talked about quasi-experiments. So now I just want to give you a couple of visuals to help reinforce the ideas I just talked about. So here's a between subjects design with two conditions, A and B. And we have one group in condition A, one in condition B, and this could be a hot room and a cold room, or an old shoe and a new shoe, whatever you want them to be. Here we have a within subjects design with three conditions, in which we have one group following the AB order and one group following the BA order. So in my shoe example, you would have this first group of two people would run with shoe A at time 1 and run with shoe B at time 2. And the other group of two people down here would run with shoe B at time 1 and shoe A at time 2. So here, like I said, in a within subjects design, there's random assignment to orders of conditions. And this process of randomly assigning people to orders of conditions is called counterbalancing. So this is a within subjects design that's making use of counterbalancing. And counterbalancing is needed in all within subjects designs for the results to be valid, and we'll get into why that's the case in just a few minutes. And I just wanted to once again show you a couple more visuals just to help reinforce some ideas we've been talking about. So here we have an experiment in which two people are taking an exam with classical music and two people taking the same exam with silence. And it's a between subjects design because each person is being tested once. So two people with classical, two with silence. Here we have the same experiment, except each person is taking the exam twice, one time with classical and one time with silence, and each person is providing two scores, a classical score and a silent score. And you can see how this experiment is counterbalanced because the first two people are following the A-B order, and classical followed by silence, and the second group is following the B-A order, which is it looks like silence followed by classical. And I want us to focus in on this data set a little bit more closely before we move on, just because I want to point out a few important features of this data set. So first of all, notice how notice how the classical column is half time 1 and half time 2. So these two scores, 70 and 80, both occurred at time 1, and these two scores, 80 and 90, both occurred at time 2. And if you look at the silence score column, notice how it's also half time 1, half time 2. So the 50 and 60 occurred at time 1, the 60 and 70 occurred at time 2. So since each column is half and half, it means that that the two columns are basically balanced. So if you think back to when we were talking about balancing in the context of a within subjects, I'm sorry, back in the context of a between subjects design, and I mentioned that maybe if, let's say, group one was 9 a.m., 9 a.m., 11 a.m., 11 a.m., and group two was also 9 a.m., 9 a.m., 11, and 11, and basically each group is half 9 a.m. and half 11 a.m., then time of day would be balanced. So you can see here that counterbalancing is really just another type of balancing. Um, so in counterbalancing, you're balancing the time point, basically. And yeah, so let's quickly move ahead. And it's also, if you're wondering why it's called counterbalancing, I would think about it this way. Notice how one group is following the forward order, or let's say time one followed by time two, and the other group is following the opposite or the counter order, which is time one, two followed by time one. So you have basically the order and the counter order. So counter balancing.